conception reigned for decades in the Jewish world about Soviet Jewry that serious scholarship seemed to support. It went like this. By the time the USSR disintegrated in the late 1980s, the bulk of Soviet Jews had lost their Jewish identity compared to other diaspora communities, and of course, compared to Jewish Israelis. A great friend of the Nevzlin Center, Professor Tzvi Gittleman, even coined a term for it, the thin identity among Soviet Jews. In a way, this orientation towards Soviet Jewry was comforting for many diaspora Jews. After all, even if we lived in New York, Sydney, or London, and had greatly integrated into our societies, the rates of intermarriage had risen sharply after the Second World War. But at least we were still more Jewish than those secularized Soviet Jews. Among Israelis, there's been a belief that many, maybe most Olim from the former Soviet Union don't fully carry Zionist legacies. Yes, even I got used to thinking that I, a Zionist who grew up in the United States and emigrated to Israel as a young man, had little in common with Soviet Olim other than the fact that we all wound up in this small Middle Eastern country. Then something unexpected happened. This story begins in 2013 at an event hosted by the Nevzlin Center to launch a new book edited by our friend Yaakov Ro'i, The Jewish Movement in the Soviet Union. My role there was as chairperson of a discussion panel. Someone was on that panel that I had heard of before but never met, Dov Kantorer. Dov was there because he'd been active in the Jewish national movement in the Soviet Union before emigrating to Israel. Once in Israel, he became a staple in our Russian language press. During the panel, some curious similarities in our life stories bubbled up, even though we'd grown up on opposite sides of the Cold War, eyeing one another's countries with suspicion and perhaps maybe even some fascination. For one, we were both born in 1963. I came to Israel in 1982. He arrived 6 years later. We both grew up in identified Jewish families, Dov in Moscow to Soviet Jewish intellectual parents who had moved from Ukraine to the capital. I grew up in a small town to refugee parents from Europe. Dov came of age in a family that fit Tzvi Gittleman's definition of thin Jewish identity, but he was surrounded by other Jews. I'd grown up in a conventional American Jewish family, in a conservative synagogue that included many East European immigrants. So far, nothing that came up during our panel shook my understanding of the Jewish past. But as Dov spoke that evening in 2013, intriguing parallels emerged about how we became Zionists and wound up in Israel as young men. First came our shock when we heard about the start of the Yom Kippur War while standing outside our respective synagogues on October 6, 1973. Both of us were 10 years old that day, and on that day, he and I both resolved that we would make Aliyah. It also turned out that we had both read Leon Uris's Exodus as adolescents. But there was one important difference. It was on my family's bookshelf at home, while Dov read it as Samizdat. Coupled with the inspiration from heroic stories we heard about the Yom Kippur War, the simplistic tale of survival and rebirth that we soaked up from Exodus seemed to make it impossible that we wouldn't wind up in Israel. Exodus probably had an even greater impact on my young, impressionable mind, because I also saw the movie. After all, what healthy young Jew wouldn't want to be part of the same story with Paul Newman and Eva Marie Saint? What else did Dov and I learn from Exodus? Undoubtedly, we learned that the world is against us, and most Arabs are primitive and bloodthirsty, consumed by hatred for Jews in Palestine. Therefore, it made sense that only aggressive Israeli action could get things done. It also seems likely that neither Dov nor I took away from Exodus much regard for the unspoken part of that book, the suffering and dislocation of Palestinian civilians during the 1948 war. Alongside the fictionalized history we absorbed from Exodus, Dov and I also read iconic histories. Those books reinforced our view of a Jewish past characterized by victimization, which only Israel's independence repaired. Dov learned this by reading Samizdat copies of Shimon Dubnov's histories. I learned the same core narrative at Hebrew school in Connecticut through Howard Sacker's The Course of Modern Jewish History. So what struck me about the shared impacts of these books for Jews living in opposite poles of the Cold War? We'll start in the communist, illiberal Soviet Union. Estimates are that at least 60% of Jewish activists read Exodus. It was also smuggled into the gulags, where it became a hit among generations of Jewish political prisoners. Taken together, by 1964, Exodus had become a samizdat blockbuster. Soviet Jewish readers saw in themselves echoes of the secular heroes in that book. And as a byproduct of Urus's Exodus, they also saw themselves as descendants of the biblical Israelites leaving Egyptian bondage. So what did legacies of these books mean for Israeli society and politics since the arrival of more than 1 million Soviet Jews, even if only a fraction of them were activists? Well, for one, it shifted the balance of public attitudes in Israel, with more weight going towards anti-Arab biases. Consequently, electoral strength was added to the right side of the Israeli political spectrum. But it also brought an intolerance towards the rabbinate's control over everyday life. This was not the reality of Israel, Russian speakers expected to find after reading Exodus. Now, let's look at the capitalist, liberal United States. Many observers believe that the book and movie transformed the majority of American Jews from the late 1950s through the 1970s, most of whom until then had been ambivalent about Israel, into ardent Zionists. David Ben-Gurion remarked, "As a literary work, Exodus isn't much, but as a piece of propaganda, it's the greatest thing ever written about Israel." As late as 2001, Edward Said wrote, "The main narrative model that dominates American thinking still seems to be Leon Urus's Exodus." So what have these books meant for the American Jewish community and many American Jews who made Aliyah? Well, for one, they caused some disappointment. The image of Israelis they saw in Exodus did not match the behavior of most actual Israelis they met. Secondly, Exodus indirectly reinforced a generational divide in US Jewry. Why is that? The older generation of leaders in organizations like AIPAC, the UJA, and the American Jewish Committee had grown up on Exodus, just like me. Today, however, that story is mostly forgotten. Younger anti-establishment groups no longer abide solely by the century-old model of Zionism celebrated in Exodus. For better or worse, those younger activists consider it and similar works barely more than outdated propaganda. Now, for some concluding thoughts to wrap it all up. Well, first, even veteran scholars can have understandings from unexpected life experiences. What do I mean? Judging from my own encounter with Dov Kantoru, the degree of difference between modern diasporas may be much smaller than what we absorbed from old narratives about who is more Jewish or Zionist than who. Lastly, I look forward to post-COVID times when we can gather again together in person to discover more connections between East and West and how they shaped the modern Jewish world.